I realize that when giving this series of lectures that I always have this little tag on the end. Instead of having a lecture called Cities, then a lecture called Drawings, and a lecture called Dogmas, I have the and I have the Cities and Prejudices. And I hope, although it was a rather breathless lecture, that there was somehow time to make it clear that my view of these four cities was as much a prejudicial view as it was some kind of rather more a prejudicial view, and that the question is whether prejudice can be creatively used, since the underbelly of everything I talk about is whether it can be creatively used. The second one, which was drawings and, I can't remember what the and was, methods or something, processes or something, procedures. I'm not sure, and I can't remember already, whether I said much about the procedural thing or whether that was sort of implicit in describing the process. And so today, in a way, the most tricky word is the word avoidances. And I hope that my attitude towards dogmatism will emerge and probably give away the secret that my instinct is to avoid them at all costs, even though from time to time I have been involved in creating them myself. And this is a mostly text-based lecture, I suppose, which is unusual for me. And I think the most telling underscoring text that I can have is a text that it will emerge very rapidly where this text was written. But it made great play of saying, please do not touch. Do not touch. The finger was already being wagged. Well, some years ago, when I was coming to the end of my time at the Städelschule of Frankfurt, I was offered an exhibition at the very special gallery there, which is called the Porticus. And I think some of my Frankfurt friends who came to the opening were a little bit surprised when they came in the door and they saw a very simple exhibition of texts coming from me. I write, but that's not the same as being somebody who bases one's procedures upon texts. I think my own view of myself is that I write very much more like a journalist, and I only write about things that interest me, and I don't research much. I haven't got the stamina for it. Of course, there was a ramp on the left-hand side of the exhibition, and if you climbed, or walked up the ramp and turned your head, in fact, it was Peacock as usual with visual information, which was really what the exhibition was about. It was a little bit of a sort of a low-key trick. But I do write regularly. I write, and this is a sort of self-advertisement, I suppose, I write a monthly column in a magazine called The Architectural Review. And I think I've been doing that now for about 3 years. It's amazing how it accumulates. And I write about whatever comes into my head. And Paul Finch, the editor, has been very kind and said, you write about what you want to write about. I've got to write one this evening, by the way. I'm running rather late on the copy date this week, but we had to hand in a competition and had to do about 3 lectures. So I pleaded 2 more days. That means that I write it tonight, and whatever comes into my head tonight, it goes into the printer. I sort of know what I'm going to write, and I've collected the pictures first. In the course of these pieces, of course, there's not a real overview strategy, but I am aware of the fact of trying not to be boring, B, trying not to be predictable, not too predictable, because obviously I have my hobby horses, and in fact, in a sense, doing such a column is a license to publish one's hobby horses. But I also try, and I do some primitive things, such as sort of saying, well, I mentioned Scandinavia twice in the last 6 months, so I won't mention it again for at least 3 more things. Or I'm always going on about Los Angeles. You see, I'm such a fan of it, so that I have to avoid every one of these having to be about Los Angeles or some piece of London gossip. And I haven't been to Lithuania, but I'm desperately hoping that there's, somebody sends me to Lithuania, so at least I can write about somewhere different. Except I might find it a terribly boring place. In fact, probably is a rather boring place. And therefore, I'll come back off the plane and think, God, I've got to get in on Friday. All right, I'll write about Los Angeles, because in fact, there was a famous, in yesteryear, there was a famous English writer in the Guardian newspaper, when it was still the Manchester Guardian, called Neville Cardus, who wrote about music and cricket, I believe. And there was a phrase that was put around which said, Neville Cardus, next week Beethoven or something, but it was Schumann yet again. He always wrote about the same people that he liked. And in a sense, of course, enthusiasm is the cousin of dogmatism, I suppose. What is the subtle difference between somebody who's rabidly dogmatic and somebody who's sort of, in a jolly way, enthusiastic? And perhaps that's the deceit of the English method, is to appear to be just a jolly, lightweight, light-hearted, enthusiastic person. Actually, you're as dogmatic as hell, but you balk at proceeding through the dogmatic method. So I'm going to do something unusual, and I promise I won't do it in the 3 after Christmas, but I'm putting up on the screen the text that I wrote, and I will read it. As I sit writing this, I briefly turn away from the deep gloom and doom of the televised headlines, wondering if there'll be anything left in our way of life or our way of paying for it by the time the piece reaches the press. Well, that was already about 5-6 weeks ago, so we know what. It is received wisdom that in times of little building, there's a period of reassessment and a certain shift of creativity. There's even the opportunity for the academics to lure some pretty talented people back into teaching. I'm sure you're on the telephone as we speak. And at least until things rev up again. Stimulating a rebirth of objective discussion with new speculations that are not dependent upon clients or tight schedules. Speculations of the mind as well as manners. So a good period in some ways for the regeneration of architecture as a culture. And I suppose one of the most famous people who used to hover in this building, but I think was only very rarely on the official payroll. I think he had been on the official payroll very early on, and then would sort of be seduced in on odd, curious deals. He refused, Cedric Price refused to have a sort of proper program, sort of fire station for Bognor Regis or whatever it might have been, or let's look at Luxembourg. He would set up much more ambient kind of programs, and he didn't really want the normal setup of tutorials on Wednesday and crits on a Friday. In a way, he suffered through this, that a lot of rather good students at this sort of couldn't handle the erraticness and the open-endedness of such a non-program. And in a way, that was all right too, because he would be somebody you would come and listen to, and you would listen to on a jury. I don't think he just did that because he never had much money or work, which he didn't. I think but he symbolizes the value in an academic institution of the special maverick figure who is not necessarily going to stay on the payroll forever. Or as now happens in many institutions, perhaps it's not this, where you set your trajectory on ratcheting up through various brownie points and PhDs and other devices. Just before the gloom got going, the Venice Architecture always acted as a charming entr'acte where we could indulge in and gossip about architecture that was, in the Aaron Betsky's terms, beyond architecture. Though what we saw wasn't really far beyond that which any reasonably active lecture-goer and magazine sniffer has already seen. It was just bigger, more plasticky, or more real vegetable instead of photographed vegetable, accompanied by the punters themselves. And of course that's really what the Biennale is about. It's actually bumping into the people what do it and then each other in various guises. Using Venice as a point of cultural definition also involves the much maligned national pavilions. And you can never help the instinct to make a beeline to your own mother ship. Before I move on to the mother ship, were lots of things, as I've described, sort of the glossing of otherwise fairly fatuous information. I love Massimiliano Fuxas, but really once you've seen a bit of shiny green wall and your wife has walked through it wearing a not-so-shiny green skirt, what more is there to say? And then there are lots of, people enjoying themselves. Greg Lynn, who's a very clever man, having a bit of fun with a bit of a dog, a bit of a blue dog. Now, I'm sure if somebody else had done an exhibit ending up with a blue dog with a black nose, it would have probably got heavily criticized. But he is, after all, a favored, he's a lovely guy, and he would have some disarming piece of statement maybe about being for his kids or using it on surfing with it or something. And so in a sense, one goes to the Venice Biennale, not giving necessarily objective readings, but looking to see who the label is first, and then saying, well, then it's Greg Lynn, it must be all right. Whereas if it's Otto Schmunk, or Thrugsby, from Venezuela, you say, God, fucking terrible rubbish going on in Venezuela. And of course, there's some silly. I mean, there is some stuff which one can't be that objective. It's my God, here we are. What toy? It's sort of like Italy somewhere about 1980 relived with a bit of sort of something that they got cheap from builders merchants, painted up. Or am I being like those people who go to concerts and say, I can't understand the music, it doesn't sound like Beethoven? A bit of both. There are certain things which I find I just find them irritating and space occupiers. And then one's bias comes in. Yes, I've seen lots of Frank Gehry things. I haven't actually seen somebody plastering one. So I suppose that's all right. It's rather like somebody there's a wonderful tailor's shop in Porto, which has these sort of dummies with suits on that come up and down from under the floor. The suits are pretty ordinary, but them popping up out of the floor is quite nice. And this may or may not be the best bit of Frank Gehry. It's not a bad bit of Frank Gehry. And it's nice seeing it being plastered. And then you can go back the next day and see it being more plastered. My God, if you're there long enough, you can go back 5 days later and see much, much more plastering. Whether this is actually breaking through on the level of sort of key architectural information, I'm not so sure. But that's sort of what the Venice Biennale seems to be about. Shock, horror, despair, sadness, distaste, misery, misery, misery. At a level of pretension that leaves one's gasping, the British Pavilion takes seriousness to a new dimension of Cromwellian piety, while legitimately criticizing the banalities of consumer commercial British housing the last 20 years. The curator, Ellis Woodman, who you can read in BD, praising the exhibit since he works on BD, presents a show of quite deliberate interpretational mannerism as to make his real intention very clear. Under the mantle of reasoned thinking, this is actually a show of Puritan zeal, where even the guru, Tony Fretton, is for once outmaneuvered by Sergus and Bates, who ponderously come across as even grimmer than their familiar grim. Please do not touch. Keep away. Quite what this is saying about architecture, I find it difficult to deal with. I know parts of the outer fringes of Cairo, which have things that look like this. After all, they didn't have the money that we still have here. The guy just off the picture is obviously puzzled too, I think. For those who have a pictorial memory, The architecture of fascist Italy comes immediately to mind. Indeed, the stripped-down presentation accentuates this impression. Friends from other places, and I bumped into, this one does, lots and lots of people around the Biennale gardens, they kept saying, oh yes, your pavilion it's very dry, but had no need to recall a history of tedium and architectural whinge that occurs from time to time on the British scene. The deliberately dull accompanied by the pious, drone, the architecture of the wagged finger. Thank God that history suggests that by a moment of great British invention and playfulness, fascist Italy, on the one hand, waiting for the hero of the wagged finger to appear. Intriguing, of course, always, you can always find exceptions to this. Why was it that Tirani was nonetheless an interesting and inventive architect who was providing material for the same guys? But I digress. Certainly, let's just take Willie Alsop as an example. There are always moments at which the English do a creative silly. And of course, you can argue that Willie himself, as myself too, have had our opportunities in the British Pavilion in previous times. But I doubt whether Willie ever actually talks to the people who did the aforementioned material. And I think it becomes even increasingly difficult for the Willie Alsops of the world to carry on without being browbeaten for doing a very different architecture. Now, by night, one was drawn to a semi-secret institution on the official fringe of the Biennale, where a guy called Robert White runs a thing called the Dark Side Club, though it was conceived by Odile Deck and Paul Finch. And it's developed into being both heavy-duty and what I would call the stuff of coercive gossip. He threw open the first night to a hero of this institution, after all, Patrick Schumacher, who introduced 8 of what I would call the parametric fraternity. It was, in fact, I think, called the Parametric Manifesto. In different way, they too droned on, one after the other, picking away at procedures and niceties of parametric design, with glazed eyes, and often with a level of pedantry that's not ideal at 1:30 in the morning, probably not very good any other time. They presented with their own style of piety and missionary zeal. Intriguingly, though, there are sometimes exceptions. Even in the British Pavilion, there was Alex de Rijk and co. doing something in colour, and being but put at the back where they couldn't sort of destroy the seance. It was fascinating to hear several of the speakers lay heavy emphasis on their, I've said adherence here, but I would say actually being members. In fact, 2 of them at least said, I am now a parametric architect, and therefore all else is different. Their adherence to Schumacher's Parametricist Manifesto. And then I'm doing a naughty little quote, because it's more about the language than what it's trying to say. Parametric variations trigger Gestalt catastrophes. Is that a good idea? Could it be cool? What does it really mean? Could be creative, but it's sort of jargony. Well, we're all jargony. If it is a good idea, we want to see where it gets us. What can happen creatively and not just methodologically. Buffeted on the one side by the British Pavilion's dogma, and on the other by the parametric dogma, one crept away, feeling completely sort of flattened and depressed. And here's the hero himself. Intriguingly, of course, the only photograph I could find on Google, since I'm a low-key operator, like you guys, I guess, meaning, should I have phoned Patrick and said, have you got a high-res, super glossy number 3 photograph which does not have a Zaha Hadid book open in front of you? You see, because I think therein lies, if one is a sort of creative cynic and observer of psychology, one is intrigued that, in a way, poor Patrick, who actually keeps that office going, at least he's there pretty much every day, and he has to disengage. I mean, he is engaged, but must distinguish himself. And perhaps, and one reads it, that the Parametric Manifesto is a heroic effort to say, I am the intellectual, she is the genius. I put it too simply, perhaps, and perhaps there are many more layers, but it's an intriguing. I'm being it to you who probably knows better. And so there are giveaways when we actually look at the document itself. And the first line, or the first line I've chosen to show is, it says, parametricism is a mature style. Parametricism is a mature style. Not a position, not a methodology, not a series of observations, but a style. Spies here. Woo-hoo. Does it work? lack of order and willfulness. The plan holds the essence of sensation. The great problems of tomorrow puts a question of plan in a new form, etc. He probably didn't sound like that at all. But with a man called Hans Witwer, he was able to produce some quite interesting projects. Of course, one's always being a cynic, says, if he was a tough Marxist intellectual, perhaps he needed Hans to do the drawing. I'm not sure. This is me being very prejudiced indeed, suggesting that those with the loudest voices often can't draw. I suspect you can hear me anyway. And so Meyer's stuff is full of immense lists of things. There's one sort of slightly amusing list, if I can find the right reference, where he reduces architecture down to a very small set of things. I can't find the list. Anyhow, he was given to doctrines and lists, and he eliminated half the interesting people who were teaching at the Bauhaus. In the end, Gropius got pissed off with this and threw him out. And he went to Russia and then various other sort of politically correct places. And I think it's interesting because, in a way, we now, many, even I'm generations away from the Bauhaus, and we have a sort of packaged view of the Bauhaus. What we are not told is about all the curriculum stresses that there may have been and the political stresses, and the fact that if you bring, and Gropius is obviously a brilliant operator, and then handing it over to somebody who was perhaps less good operator but had fire in his eyes, and it didn't quite work. And that raises a very interesting issue about the relationship between people who are declaimers and people who subtly get things moving. The other interesting contrast, I think, is one which was nearer to being contemporary with myself, not quite our period, a little bit before Archigram, came a group called the Situationists. And the key spokesman was a guy called Guy Debord. When I say spokesman, I guess the key philosopher, the key motivator was Guy Debord, who was saddened by the sort of lack of spirituality in modern life, and had a distaste both of Western capitalism and the methods of the sort of Soviet system as well, and is reputed to be the person who really was behind the 1968 uprisings. That's a sort of gross oversimplification. And he also, of course, was constantly writing strictures, some of which are sort of readable, some of them not. But he has a minimum program of the International Situationists, includes both the striving for perfect spatial art. I'm not quite sure how you would have a perfect spatial art, but nonetheless he was trying to get there. And which must extend to a unitary system of town planning. One system of town planning. My God. And the search for new modes of behavior. And then he had this list, which I can't find, which is quite hilarious, about what the only things that you could include in making a house, which was having a kitchen, having sex, and having a sort of garage or something, some sort of very simplistic, strange list. And then, of course, some people, he and his friends were quite not against using the sort of Bauhaus if they wanted to, or in fact more especially Dada. I mean, they really, really wanted to be Dadaists too. But the point they missed was that the Dada guys were much more loopy, much more inconsistent, and never stuck with their story. I mean, they were far too creative for that. But, Situationism wanted to incorporate this. The final irony is, of course, that the person who really inspired ourselves, and I can remember Mike Webb and I going to the Institute of Contemporary Arts of the day and listening to this guy, well, looking actually at the stuff that this guy had. He had the most, I couldn't find any in colour, but he had the most delicious you've ever seen at the time colour slides, big format colour slides of this New Babylon project. And it was stunning. Mike and I sat in the back there and said, we've got to do something good. And we went away and got on our bikes, as it were. But it was totally inspiring as a piece of architecture and invention. What happened to him? There we are, more and more of this extraordinarily wonderful project. The board kicked him out of the Situationist group. One wonders why. Was it purely because he was sort of not spending enough time reading the texts? Because he was doing this lovely scheme? I don't know. I'm a cynic. I'm not a historian. My opinions are not correct. They're simply sort of angled views on things. Or, of course, we have Le Corbusier himself. Now, when I first read Corbusier as a schoolboy, there were lots of funny books, and I'd never read anything like this, but I was keen to be an architect, and I thought, wow, this is the thing. If you come to be an architect and you write these extraordinary statements, and you wave your arms around, and you draw funny things, that must be what it's all about. And these marvelous, wonderful, simple statements. Hello! There you go. You know, I don't know what he sounded like. But actually, when push comes to shove, he communicates through his passion for the making of the stuff. And it was interesting in his lecture last night, Peter Eisenman said that something along the lines that Corbusier never had a cynical bone in his body. And I thought that was a lovely statement. And it's really paralleling the point I want to make, that in the end, you know, maybe the statements, the exhibitions, the pamphlets were consciously very secondary, that the guy is so creative and inventive, and that even the speed of the writing, you see, going with the explanation of the thing, puts him in a completely different category, even though he must have, he rode the bandwagon of things like Siam, as everybody else did at the time. And coming to a contemporary figure and friend, we have the intriguing case of Wolf Fricks, of Carp Himmelblau. Here, this is his chosen photograph from his book, Get Off My Cloud. It's interesting because if you take him, he doesn't look like a sort of man of passion. He looks like a sort of friendly guy. You know, he's sort of just heard quite an amusing joke, and he's going to, you know, have a cigar in a minute, etc. But in fact, it is an illustration for the book, Get Off My Cloud, and it's a passionate statement. Get the fuck off my cloud, you feel him saying, except probably the publisher told him to take out the swear word. And I can remember the period when Carp Himmelblau made the famous flame and said, Architektur muss brunnen. I think that's the word. Architecture must burn. And they made this great, extraordinary flame in the courtyard of the Technical University of Graz. And the passion is there, but in the end, it was the things being made, even the design of the flame, even the design of the armature to carry the flame is a very particular piece of designing, and probably interested them as much as actually, you know, the thing of having the flame. So I come to observe the detail of optimism. When I use the word avoidance, I don't say that you shouldn't read. I'm not going to be as declamatory as that, and some of you will read and be passionate. And I have a strong suspicion of myself that I was very, very conscious of Fröhlich when doing the first archigram. Certainly I had been reading Rainer Banham's review of the Ulstein-Barvelt book that came out about Fröhlich. I went and ordered it at a bookshop round the corner, only to find when it had arrived that it was all in German and only had 5 illustrations in it. And I still parted with my 20 quid or whatever it was, and had to sort of ask Banham, what does it really say inside there, because I can't read German. But I was inspired by this combination of things and statements and the variety of that within Fröhlich. There were some very intriguing bedfellows. They weren't all doing the same kind of mannerism at all. In fact, Bruno Taut himself later became the city architect of Berlin, and I think for a short time the city architect of Magdeburg. And he did social housing blocks. In fact, I think his one is the one sort of in the lower middle, the long one. And this is intriguing, that somebody who had been a sort of rhetorical person, he had also, of course, done the wonderful glass pavilion in Cologne in 1914, but known as a real sort of gear up of people, a real sort of inclusive person, and also an encourager. That did not mean that he did not have a strong commitment to socialism, and he put his money where his mouth was by designing some very, very decent social housing. At the same time, I will read this fast. Away with the sourpusses, the wailing willies, the sobersides, the brow furrowers, the eternally serious. The sweet sour ones are forever important. Important, important. The damn habit of acting important. Tombstone and cemetery facades in front of junk shops and old clothes stores. Smash the shell lime Doric, Ionic and Corinthian columns. Demolish the pinheads. Down with the respectability of sandstone and plate glass in fragments, with the rubbish of marble and precious wood to the garbage heap with all that junk. Oh, our concepts, space, home, style. How these concepts stink. Destroy them. Put an end to them. Let nothing remain. Chase away their schools. Let the professional wigs fly. We'll play cat with them. Blast, blast, lest the dusty, matted, gummed-up world of concept ideologies and systems feel our cold north wind. Death to the concept nice. Death to everything stuffy. Death to everything called title, dignity, authority. Down with everything serious. And I think I'm into that. Absolutely. Looks fairly reasonable bloke, actually. All in all. Serious, bit of unkempt hair, tie not very straight. Reasonable guy. Bit scary eyes. And I think that for me, summarizes the whole situation. And I'm very aware of the fact that I didn't show any of the parametric people who were in the lecture, because you get those guys all the time. I think half of them are teaching here. You get that stuff rammed down your throat constantly. And all I am is some little sort of tweet person allowed in the door to say, hold on a minute. Number one, it's obscure. Number two, it's pious. Number three, I'm on the same side, but I wish they wouldn't kind of ram it down your throat in quite such a boring way. End of conversation.